Baron Trump ordered to switch VIP seats for an older passenger. One call later, the entire team is fired. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The boarding gate buzzed with the usual commotion of travelers eager to find their seats, their chatter blending with the airline staff's announcements. Among the crowd was Baron Trump, quietly standing near his mother. Though accustomed to the privilege of first-class travel, he had a reserved demeanor that set him apart from the stereotypical image of wealth. At just 16, he carried himself with a maturity beyond his years, preferring to observe rather than speak. As the passengers filed into the aircraft, an airline attendant approached Baron's family. The woman looked frazzled, her professional smile barely concealing her anxiety. She explained that an elderly passenger, Mrs. Margaret Hensley, had mistakenly been booked on an oversold flight and now had no seat in first class. The staff had exhausted all other options and were hesitant to disturb the other VIP passengers. Without hesitation, Baron stepped forward. "She can have my seat," he said, his voice calm yet firm. His mother raised an eyebrow, questioning his decision silently, but she said nothing. The attendant looked relieved, thanking him profusely as she led Margaret to the vacated seat. As Baron gathered his carry-on bag and headed toward the economy section, a wave of whispers trailed behind him. Fellow passengers, many of whom had recognized him, began murmuring about his unexpected gesture. Some snapped pictures, subtly capturing the moment on their phones, while others simply exchanged impressed glances. Settling into his new seat, Baron noticed the stark contrast between the two sections. The narrow row and bustling atmosphere of economy felt worlds apart from the spacious luxury he was used to, yet he didn't mind. Next to him sat a man in his 60s, wearing a worn leather jacket and an old pilot's cap. The man introduced himself as George Lawson, a retired airline captain who had flown for the same carrier decades earlier. "Not every day you see someone in your position give up their seat," George said, offering a knowing smile. "Your parents must have taught you well." Baron shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It just seemed like the right thing to do. The two fell into easy conversation. George regaled Baron with stories of his flying days, painting a vivid picture of an era when the airline was considered the gold standard of service. But as their talk deepened, George's tone grew somber. He described how the company had declined over the years, plagued by poor leadership and greed. Recently, he had tried to expose unethical practices within the airline's management, but had been stonewalled at every turn. Baron listened intently, his curiosity piqued. The sincerity in George's voice struck a chord, and for the first time, Baron saw the human side of an industry he had taken for granted. Though their conversation was interrupted occasionally by the bustle of the flight attendants, Baron felt a growing respect for the man beside him. Meanwhile, in first class, Margaret Hensley couldn't stop thanking the airline staff and fellow passengers for their kindness. She didn't know Baron's name or status, but she spoke of him to everyone who would listen, her gratitude pouring out in every word. Her story began to spread among the passengers, and before long, social media posts about the mysterious young man in first class had gone viral. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Baron looked out of his window, unaware that his small act of kindness was setting the wheels of a much larger story into motion. In that moment, he was content with the simple satisfaction of having done the right thing, oblivious to the chain reaction his decision had begun to trigger. The plane hummed steadily as passengers settled into their seats, many still buzzing about the young man who had willingly given up his VIP spot in first class. Mrs. Margaret Hensley basked in her unexpected upgrade, marveling at the soft leather seats and impeccable service. She chatted amiably with other passengers, sharing how a young man had selflessly offered her his seat when no one else had stepped forward. Her story spread like wildfire, fueling admiration among those on board. One of these passengers was Amelia Grant, a prominent investigative journalist known for her no-nonsense reporting. Sharp-eyed and intuitive, Amelia had been observing the unfolding drama with quiet interest. A seasoned traveler, she had grown accustomed to the cold indifference often displayed in first class, where privilege seemed to trump kindness. Witnessing Baron's gesture piqued her curiosity. "Who is this kid?" she murmured to herself, pulling out her tablet to skim the trending hashtag kindness on wings, which had begun gaining traction online. She quickly discovered that the boy was none other than Baron Trump, the youngest son of former President Donald Trump. Intrigued, she decided to introduce herself after the seatbelt sign turned off. Amelia left her seat and made her way toward economy class. She found Baron chatting with an older man, his posture relaxed but attentive. As she approached, Baron looked up, meeting her gaze with calm curiosity. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Amelia asked, gesturing to the empty seat nearby. "Sure," Baron replied politely. George gave a nod of acknowledgement before leaning back to let the two converse. "I just wanted to say that what you did was admirable," Amelia began. "You don't often see that kind of consideration these days, especially in first class." Baron shrugged modestly. "It just felt like the right thing to do. Mrs. Hensley seemed like she needed it more than I did." Amelia studied him for a moment, noting his calm demeanor and straightforward response. "I'm Amelia Grant, by the way. I'm a journalist. Your gesture has sparked quite a buzz online." "I noticed a few people taking pictures," Baron said, glancing toward his phone, which had started pinging with notifications. "But I didn't expect it to go anywhere." "It's not just about the gesture," Amelia continued. "It's about what it represents. In a world that's increasingly self-centered, small acts of kindness stand out and sometimes reveal much bigger stories." Before Baron could respond, George leaned forward, interjecting, "Speaking of bigger stories, I was just telling Baron about the mess this airline is in. Years of mismanagement, safety concerns, and corruption have turned it into a shadow of what it once was." Amelia's interest sharpened. "Corruption? Tell me more." George hesitated, glancing at Baron before continuing. "I worked for this airline for over 30 years. It used to be one of the best in the business, but that changed when new leadership came in. They slashed maintenance budgets, cut corners on safety, and lined their pockets with the savings. I've tried to bring it to light, but no one's willing to listen." Amelia's mind raced. This could be more than just a human interest piece about a teenager's act of kindness. It could expose systemic corruption in one of the nation's largest airlines. She leaned in closer, her journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. "George, I think it's time someone listened. If you're willing to share what you know, I can help bring your story to the public." George looked at her skeptically, his face etched with years of disappointment. "You think anyone's going to care? These executives are untouchable. They've got money, lawyers, and influence." "They might," Baron interjected, his tone thoughtful, "if the right people get involved." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "And do you know the right people?" Baron gave a small, enigmatic smile. "I might." The conversation was interrupted by the flight attendant serving drinks, but Amelia had already made up her mind. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of a story that could change everything. As she returned to her seat, her thoughts were already spinning, piecing together the puzzle that George had begun to lay before her. Meanwhile, Baron gazed out of the window, feeling a subtle shift in the air. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he knew that his small act of kindness had set something in motion, something bigger than himself. By the time the flight landed, Baron Trump's quiet gesture of kindness had become a wildfire on social media. Passengers' tweets and photos detailing how a young man gave up his first-class seat for an elderly woman were accompanied by the hashtag kindness on wings, which was now trending globally. The story caught the attention of influencers, news outlets, and even celebrities who chimed in with messages praising the mysterious teenager's altruism. Baron's phone buzzed incessantly as notifications piled up. He scrolled through the posts with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. His father, Donald Trump, was among the first to call, his voice equal parts amused and proud. "Well, kid," Donald said over the line, "seems like you're the star of the day. You've got the media eating this up." Baron, who had never been one for the spotlight, sighed. "It wasn't a big deal, Dad. People are just making it into something it's not." "It is a big deal," his father countered. "The world loves stories like this. They need them, but you'd better brace yourself. This kind of attention has a way of pulling in more than just praise." Baron didn't quite understand what his father meant until later that day, when the ripple effects of his actions began to take unexpected turns. Elsewhere, in a sleek Manhattan office, Walter Hayes, a mogul and longtime ally of the Trump family, was scrolling through the trending hashtag kindness on wings. Hayes, known for his sharp eye for stories that resonated with the public, immediately sensed there was more to this than a feel-good moment. He dialed Donald Trump's number. "Donald, this hashtag kindness on wings thing your kid started? There's potential here," Hayes began. "But it's not just about the gesture. Did you know Amelia Grant was on that flight? She's digging into the airline's dirt. There's a much bigger story brewing." Donald listened carefully, his instincts sharpening. "How big are we talking?" "Big enough to shake up the industry. Amelia is one of the best, and she doesn't chase shadows. If she's on to something, it could mean corruption, mismanagement, maybe worse. And your boy's act of kindness is the perfect lens for the public to view it through." Donald glanced at Baron, who was sitting across the room, thumbing through his phone. "All right, keep me updated. If this turns into something, I want to make sure the right people are held accountable." Meanwhile, Amelia Grant was hard at work. Upon landing, she wasted no time compiling her notes and reviewing the conversation she'd had with George Lawson. The retired pilot had painted a bleak picture of the airline's internal workings, hinting at years of corruption and neglect. The more Amelia dug, the more pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Leaked emails obtained through her sources hinted at budget cuts to maintenance departments, falsified safety records, and inflated executive bonuses, all orchestrated by the airline's top brass. It was clear that the airline was a house of cards, and Amelia was determined to be the one to bring it tumbling down. At the same time, George Lawson arrived home to find an outpouring of support online. Passengers who had overheard his conversation with Amelia began sharing snippets of what they'd learned. turning George into an unintentional whistleblower. While he was initially apprehensive about the attention, he couldn't ignore the possibility that this might be the opportunity he had long hoped for to expose the airline's wrongdoing. Back at the Trump residence, Barron found himself reflecting on the strange series of events that had unfolded since he stepped onto the plane. What had started as a simple gesture of kindness had become something far greater. His father's words lingered in his mind. This kind of attention has a way of pulling in more than just praise. As he watched the story unfold online, Barron couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something monumental. Little did he know, the ripple effects of his actions were about to collide with forces far beyond his control. George Lawson sat at his modest kitchen table, staring at the flurry of notifications on his phone. Over the past 24 hours, his name had been mentioned in dozens of tweets, with people tagging him as the retired pilot who knew the dark truths about the airline. He had spent years trying to get anyone to listen, filing complaints with regulatory bodies and contacting journalists, only to be ignored or dismissed. Now, thanks to a random act of kindness on a flight, his story was gaining traction. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences. A knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, Amelia Grant stood on the porch, holding a folder and wearing a determined expression. "George," she began, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk. The story is snowballing, and if we don't get ahead of it, the airline is going to bury you." He hesitated, glancing at the folder in her hands. "What kind of evidence do you have?" Amelia placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing printed emails, internal memos, and financial documents. "Enough to make a compelling case," she said, tapping on one of the pages. "But we need more. We need your first-hand account, dates, incidents, everything you've seen over the years. If we can put this together, we can blow the lid off the whole operation." George sank into a chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Do you know what you're asking? These people are ruthless. They've silenced employees before, and they'll do it again." Amelia leaned forward, her tone firm but empathetic. "I know it's risky, but this is your chance to make a difference. With the attention this story is getting, they can't afford to sweep it under the rug, and you won't be alone. I've already reached out to some legal experts, and I've spoken with Barron's family. They're willing to help." George blinked in surprise. "The Trumps? What do they have to do with this?" "Barron's father has powerful connections, and he's offered to support you. Financially, legally, whatever it takes. But this only works if you're willing to stand up and tell your story." For a long moment, George was silent, staring at the damning documents spread out before him. He thought about the years he had spent in frustration, watching an airline he once loved fall into ruin. He thought about the colleagues who had lost their jobs because they refused to play along with the corruption. Most of all, he thought about the passengers who trusted the airline with their lives, unaware of the risks they were taking every time they boarded a plane. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll do it." Amelia's face lit up with relief. "Good. We'll start putting everything together tonight. But first, we need to get you some protection." Hours later, Amelia and George sat in a conference room in downtown Manhattan, joined by Donald Trump's legal team. The lawyers were sharp and efficient, outlining the steps they would take to protect George and ensure the evidence reached the right authorities. Barron sat quietly in the corner, observing the proceedings with a mix of curiosity and unease. "George," one of the lawyers said, "this is going to get messy. The airline will fight back hard. Are you sure you're ready for this?" George glanced at Barron, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "I'm ready," he said firmly. That night, Amelia began drafting the first installment of her expose. She worked late into the night, piecing together George's account with the evidence she had gathered. Every word carried weight. every sentence a calculated strike against the airline's fortress of secrecy. She knew that once the story broke, there would be no turning back. Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, CEO Harold Pierce was alerted to the brewing storm. He scowled as his team briefed him on the whistleblower and the journalist digging into their operations. "Handle it," he snapped, his tone icy. "Make it go away." But it was too late. The wheels had already been set in motion, and there was no stopping the tidal wave of truth that was about to hit. The atmosphere in the Trump residence was unusually tense as Barron sat at the dining table, quietly scrolling through his phone. Notifications from social media continued to pour in, each one adding to the growing public interest in his simple act of kindness. But the tone of the messages had shifted. Alongside the praise were questions about the airline's practices, safety standards, and management. The hashtag kindness on wings had taken on a new life, becoming a rallying cry for accountability. Donald Trump walked into the room, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. "Barron," he said, taking a seat across from his son, "we need to talk about this situation. It's bigger than you think." Barron looked up, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Donald leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That journalist, Amelia Grant, she's uncovered some serious dirt on the airline. Corruption, safety violations, embezzlement, the works. And your little moment of kindness on that flight? It's become the catalyst for exposing all of it." Barron frowned, trying to process his father's words. "So what happens now?" Donald held up his phone, showing a list of messages from his contacts. "I've been getting calls all day. Walter Hayes, the media tycoon, is one of them. He says this story could bring down the airline's top executives. But it's not going to be easy. They're already scrambling to cover their tracks." As if on cue, Donald's phone buzzed with another call. He glanced at the screen and smirked. "Speak of the devil. It's Walter." He answered the call, switching it to speakerphone. "Donald." Walter's booming voice filled the room. "Have you seen the latest? Amelia Grant's digging deeper than anyone expected. She's got a retired pilot spilling his guts about the airline's corruption. This could be the biggest scandal of the year." Donald chuckled. "And my kid's in the middle of it. You think this will stick?" Walter's tone turned serious. "It will if we play it right. The public loves stories like this. An act of kindness exposing greed and corruption. But we need to amplify it. If the airline's PR team gets ahead of this, they'll spin it into nothing. We have to act fast." Donald nodded, already formulating a plan. All right, Walter, let's make some calls. Get Amelia everything she needs. Legal support, media coverage, whatever it takes. I'm on it, Walter said before hanging up. Donald turned back to Baron, his expression softening. You've started something important, kid, but now it's time to see it through. Baron nodded slowly, realizing the gravity of the situation. What do you need me to do? For now, just keep being you, Donald said. The rest will fall into place. Meanwhile, at Amelia Grant's apartment, the journalist was hard at work piecing together the next phase of her expose. George Lawson had provided her with detailed accounts of the airline's internal corruption, and her sources were confirming every claim. But she knew that breaking this story wouldn't be easy. The airline's CEO, Harold Pierce, was a master at manipulating the media and suppressing dissent. As she reviewed her notes, her phone rang. It was one of her sources inside the airline. Amelia, the voice on the other end said, "They know what you're doing. Pierce is furious. He's calling in favors to shut this down." Amelia smirked, undeterred. "Let him try. I've got the truth on my side." The next day, the airline launched a counteroffensive. Press releases flooded the media, painting the whistleblowers as disgruntled employees with an axe to grind. Social media was inundated with posts defending the company and discrediting Amelia's reporting. But the public wasn't buying it. The hashtag kindness on wings continued to trend, with more passengers and employees coming forward to share their experiences. At the heart of it all, Baron remained a reluctant hero. He hadn't sought attention or intended to start a movement, yet here he was, watching as his small act of kindness unraveled a web of greed and deceit. As he scrolled through his phone that evening, he stumbled upon a video of George Lawson addressing the public. "This isn't just about me," George said, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about the passengers who trust this airline with their lives and the employees who work tirelessly to keep them safe. We deserve better, and thanks to one young man's kindness, we now have a chance to demand it." Baron put down his phone, a mix of pride and apprehension swelling within him. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You've started something important." He could only hope they were right. Inside the towering glass building of the airline's corporate headquarters, tension was at a breaking point. Harold Pierce, the airline's CEO, sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table, surrounded by his executive team. The room was quiet except for the hum of a projector displaying recent headlines on the wall. Each article highlighted the mounting scandal. Whistleblower exposes airline's corruption, retired pilot reveals shocking safety violations, and a kind gesture sparks industry-wide scrutiny. Pierce's face was a mask of barely contained fury. "This circus," he began, his voice low and venomous, "needs to end now. How did we let it get this far?" His chief operating officer, Marlene Davis, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We underestimated the media's interest in the story, and that journalist Amelia Grant. She's relentless. Every leak we've tried to plug, she finds another hole." Pierce slammed his fist on the table, causing several executives to flinch. "I don't want excuses, Marlene. I want results. The board is breathing down my neck. Shareholders are panicking, and our stock price has dropped 15% in the last 2 days. This is unacceptable." Another executive, the head of public relations, spoke up cautiously. "We've launched a counter-campaign on social media, pushing positive narratives about the airline, but public sentiment is against us. People are siding with the whistleblowers." Pierce leaned back in his chair, his racing mind reflecting on the years he'd spent cultivating his image as a visionary leader, someone who had turned the struggling airline into a profitable giant. But behind the scenes, his methods had been anything but ethical. Now, with George Lawson and Amelia Grant shining a light on his practices, his carefully constructed empire was crumbling. "We need to control the narrative," Pierce said finally. "Amelia Grant is the real threat here. Discredit her. Dig up anything you can, old scandals, questionable sources, whatever it takes. If we undermine her credibility, the story dies." Marlene hesitated. "And what about George Lawson?" Pierce's lips curled into a cold smile. "He's just an old man clinging to the past. We can deal with him later. Right now, our priority is stopping Grant." While the executives plotted, Amelia Grant was already one step ahead. In the downtown office she had rented as her temporary war room, she sat surrounded by piles of documents, notes, and a small team of trusted colleagues. George Lawson sat nearby, reviewing his own notes, his hands steady despite the pressure. Amelia's phone buzzed with a call from one of her sources within the airline. "They're gunning for you," the voice on the other end warned. "Pierce has his PR team digging into your past, trying to find dirt." Amelia smirked. "Let them. I've got nothing to hide." Her confidence wasn't misplaced. Amelia had spent years building her reputation as a journalist who couldn't be intimidated or bought. But she knew this fight was different. The stakes were higher, and her opponents were more ruthless. "All right," she said, addressing her team. "Here's the plan. We need to keep the pressure on. If we let them regroup, they'll bury this story. I want George's testimony finalized and ready to release tomorrow, and double-check every piece of evidence. We can't afford even the smallest mistake." George nodded, his voice steady. "I've got years of flight logs, safety reports, and emails. They can't argue with hard data." Amelia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've been brave, George. This wouldn't be possible without you." Meanwhile, at the Trump residence, Barron was struggling to process the rapid escalation of events. He had never expected his simple decision to give up his seat to turn into a national scandal. Yet here he was, watching as his father's legal team worked alongside Amelia's to prepare for the inevitable legal battles. "Are you okay?" his father asked, noticing Barron's thoughtful expression. Barron nodded slowly. "I think so. It's just strange. All of this started because I moved seats on a plane. I didn't think it would matter." Donald smiled faintly. "That's the thing about life, son. Small actions can have big consequences. And sometimes those consequences are exactly what's needed to make a difference." Barron considered his father's words, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. Whatever happened next, he was determined to see it through. After all, this was no longer just about him. It was about the truth and the countless lives impacted by the airline's greed and negligence. At the airline's headquarters, Harold Pierce paced in his office, barking orders into his phone. But no matter how many PR strategies or legal maneuvers he tried, the tide was turning against him. He could feel the walls closing in, and for the first time, he began to wonder if this might be the end of his reign. As the sun set over the city, Pierce stared out of his window, his jaw clenched. He wasn't going down without a fight. But little did he know, his opponents were more determined and resourceful than he could ever imagine. The day Amelia Grant's expose went live, it felt like the world had stopped to watch. The headline blazed across news sites and social media platforms. "Inside the corruption of Sky-High Airlines. A whistleblower's tale," accompanied by George Lawson's harrowing testimony, leaked documents, and damning evidence of corporate malfeasance. The article left no room for doubt. The airline's culture of greed and negligence was exposed for all to see. The story spread like wildfire. News channels interrupted their programming to cover the scandal, showing clips of George detailing unsafe maintenance practices, falsified safety reports, and the intimidation tactics used to silence employees. The public was outraged. Sky-High Airlines, once a beloved name in the industry, was now the face of corporate greed. At the Trump residence, Barron sat in the living room with his family, watching the news unfold. He couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness as images of himself from the flight appeared on the screen. Barron Trump's small act of kindness inadvertently sparked one of the biggest corporate scandals of the decade, the anchor said, showing footage of the viral #KindnessOnWings posts. What started as a simple seat swap has turned into a rallying cry for accountability. "Looks like you're famous," his sister teased, nudging him. Barron shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. George and Amelia are the ones making this happen." Donald Trump, sitting across from him, smiled knowingly. "You gave people a reason to pay attention. Sometimes that's all it takes." In New York, Amelia and her team worked tirelessly to manage the fallout. Interviews with whistleblowers were scheduled around the clock, while legal teams prepared for the inevitable lawsuits. George Lawson, now hailed as a hero, found himself inundated with messages of support from current and former airline employees who had witnessed similar corruption but had been too afraid to speak out. One such employee, a mechanic named Rosa Martinez, reached out to Amelia with her own story. "I've seen planes sent out with temporary fixes that were supposed to be grounded for major repairs," Rosa said during a phone call. "They told us to keep quiet or lose our jobs. I can't stay silent anymore." Amelia quickly arranged for Rosa to share her testimony in a follow-up article, solidifying the growing case against Sky High Airlines. Every new piece of evidence added fuel to the fire, pushing the company closer to the brink. Meanwhile, at Sky High's headquarters, the atmosphere was one of panic and desperation. Harold Pierce had retreated to his office, barking orders at his PR and legal teams. "Fix this," he demanded, slamming his fist on his desk. "I don't care what it takes. We cannot afford to lose our investors." But the investors were already pulling out. Sky High stock price had plummeted by 40% within hours of the exposed release, and major shareholders were demanding answers. Several members of the board of directors, fearing for their own reputations, began distancing themselves from Pierce, leaking additional information to Amelia in hopes of saving themselves. As the scandal deepened, protests erupted outside Sky High's headquarters and at airports across the country. Passengers held signs reading, "Safety first, profit second, and we deserve better." Former employees joined the protests, sharing stories of the toxic work environment and unsafe practices they had endured. The airline's once loyal customer base now demanded boycotts and regulatory intervention. In Washington, regulators announced a sweeping investigation into Sky High Airlines, promising to hold those responsible accountable. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and subpoenas were issued to the company's top executives. For Harold Pierce, the walls were closing in. Back at Amelia's office, she prepared for her first live television interview about the expose. George and Rosa joined her, ready to share their stories with a national audience. As the cameras rolled, Amelia delivered a powerful opening statement. "This is not just about one airline," she said. "It's about an industry that has put profits over people for far too long. But thanks to brave individuals like George Lawson and Rosa Martinez, and the public's unwavering demand for accountability, we have a chance to change that." The interview was a resounding success, further galvanizing public support for reform. As night fell, Barron sat in his room, scrolling through social media. He saw countless posts from people sharing their own experiences with corrupt companies and advocating for change. A small smile crossed his face. While he hadn't planned any of this, he felt proud to have played a part in something meaningful. His phone buzzed with a message from Amelia. "Thank you, Baron. None of this would have happened without you." Baron typed a quick reply. "You and George are the real heroes. I just gave up a seat." As he put his phone down, Baron realized the truth. Even the smallest actions could spark something much larger. Sometimes a simple act of kindness was all it took to inspire a movement. Sky High Airlines executives convened in a hastily called emergency meeting in their sleek boardroom. The once pristine conference room now bore signs of chaos. Folders filled with legal documents scattered across the table, coffee cups abandoned in half-consumed states, and executives speaking in hushed, panicked tones. CEO Harold Pierce sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight and his gaze icy as he addressed his embattled team. "This is a coordinated attack," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "They're trying to dismantle everything we've built. We cannot let that happen." But despite his bravado, the walls were closing in. The regulatory investigation into Sky High Airlines had unearthed years of fraudulent practices, including falsified safety inspections, mismanagement of funds, and a trail of intimidation against whistleblowers. The Department of Transportation had suspended several operating licenses, forcing the airline to ground a significant portion of its fleet. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a veteran executive named Richard Keller, finally spoke up. "Harold, this isn't just about the media anymore. Regulators are involved, Congress is calling for hearings, we're hemorrhaging money, and our investors are threatening to pull out completely." Pierce's eyes narrowed. "And what do you suggest, Richard? That we roll over and let them destroy us?" "I suggest we take responsibility," Richard replied, his voice firm. "The longer we deny what's happening, the worse it's going to get. The public isn't buying our PR spin. It's time for a change, starting with leadership." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what Richard was implying, but no one dared say it outright. Harold Pierce clenched his fists, his face reddening with anger. "You want me to step down?" he said through gritted teeth. "It's the only way to salvage what's left of this company," Richard replied calmly. "You've become a liability, Harold. If we don't act now, there won't be a company to save." Meanwhile, the momentum outside the boardroom continued to grow. Amelia Grant's expose had sparked a national conversation about corporate accountability, with Sky High Airlines serving as the poster child for greed and corruption. Former employees and passengers alike flooded social media with their stories, using the now iconic hashtag kindness on wings. The airline's downfall had become a movement. Protests erupted at airports across the country, with passengers demanding better safety standards and employee protections. Regulatory agencies announced plans for sweeping reforms, vowing to prevent similar scandals in the future. The ripple effects were felt throughout the industry as other airlines rushed to audit their practices, fearing they might be next. At the center of it all, George Lawson found himself thrust into the spotlight. The retired pilot had gone from being a forgotten whistleblower to a national hero. He was invited to speak at rallies, testify before Congress, and even appear on late-night talk shows. Though the attention was overwhelming, George remained focused on the bigger picture. "This isn't about me," he told a crowd of protesters outside Sky High's headquarters. "This is about all of us. Passengers, employees, and everyone who deserves better from this industry. Together, we can demand the change we need." In Washington, hearings into Sky High Airlines practices were underway. George Lawson and Rosa Martinez testified before a packed chamber, recounting their experiences with the airline's corrupt leadership. Amelia Grant sat in the gallery, taking notes for her next article. Baron Trump watched the proceedings from home, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility. "George is doing great," he said to his father, who sat beside him. I'm glad he's getting the recognition he deserves. Donald Trump nodded, his expression thoughtful. He's a good man, and you gave him the platform to be heard. Never underestimate the power of what you did, Barron. Barron looked back at the screen, where George was passionately addressing the lawmakers. It doesn't feel like I did much, he admitted. I just gave up a seat. That's all it takes sometimes, Donald replied. One small act can set off a chain reaction, and look where it's led. Back at Sky High's headquarters, Harold Pierce faced his final reckoning. The board of directors, led by Richard Keller, had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO. Pierce was escorted out of the building under the watchful eyes of reporters and protesters, his once proud career in shambles. As the company began its efforts to rebuild, a new leadership team was appointed, including several whistleblowers who had come forward during the scandal. George Lawson was offered a consulting role to oversee the implementation of safety and ethical reforms, a position he accepted with pride. The domino effect continued to ripple outward. Sky High Airlines' downfall inspired similar investigations into other corporations, from airlines to financial institutions. The movement for accountability gained momentum, fueled by the public's demand for transparency and justice. For Barron, the experience was transformative. He had never imagined that a simple decision on a plane would lead to such far-reaching consequences. As he watched the world change around him, he realized the truth in his father's words. Even the smallest actions could make a difference, and sometimes they could change the world. The aftermath of the Sky High Airlines scandal left the company in a precarious position. Its reputation was in tatters, its stock price had plunged to historic lows, and public trust seemed irreparably damaged. Yet from the ashes of its corporate malfeasance, a glimmer of hope began to emerge. Under the leadership of Richard Keller, the newly appointed interim CEO, the airline embarked on an aggressive reform campaign. Keller wasted no time in implementing sweeping changes. The first order of business was to overhaul the executive team, removing every individual complicit in the company's unethical practices. This included key players who had falsified safety records, slashed maintenance budgets, and intimidated whistleblowers. George Lawson, now an integral part of the reform team, was given the title of Senior Safety Advisor. His role was more than symbolic. He was tasked with developing new protocols to ensure transparency and prioritize passenger safety. In his first meeting with the company engineers and mechanics, George made his mission clear. "We're not just fixing airplanes," he said, addressing the room with the same confidence that had carried him through years in the cockpit. "We're fixing a broken system. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's worth it." The company also announced a series of public initiatives to regain trust. Free tickets were offered to passengers affected by the scandal, along with lifetime travel vouchers for employees who had been unjustly terminated. A significant portion of the airline's profits was allocated to improving safety standards, with Keller pledging full transparency during the process. For George, his new role brought a sense of vindication. Once dismissed as a disgruntled retiree, he was now celebrated as a hero and a symbol of integrity. Yet he remained humble, crediting the movement to the countless employees and passengers who had shared their stories. On a sunny afternoon, George visited Rosa Martinez, the mechanic whose testimony had added credibility to the case against Sky High. Together, they toured one of the airline's maintenance hangars, inspecting the ongoing upgrades to equipment and processes. "This is what we've been fighting for," Rosa said, her voice filled with pride. "It's hard to believe it's finally happening." George nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's happening because people stood up and refused to be silenced, and because of one kid who reminded us that kindness still matters." Meanwhile, Amelia Grant continued her relentless pursuit of the truth. With Sky High Airlines' story largely told, she shifted her focus to broader industry reform, investigating other airlines and uncovering similar patterns of negligence and corruption. Her reporting became the cornerstone of a nationwide push for greater accountability in corporate America. In her spare moments, Amelia often thought about Barron Trump. She had been skeptical of him at first, assuming he was just another privileged teenager. But as she watched him navigate the media frenzy with humility and grace, she realized how wrong she had been. She decided to send him a handwritten note. "Dear Barron, you probably don't realize the impact of what you did that day on the plane. Your kindness reminded us all of the power of small actions. Thank you for being the spark that lit this fire. The world needs more people like you. Best, Amelia." Back at the Trump residence, Barron was coming to terms with his unexpected role in the movement. He had avoided interviews and media appearances, preferring to let George and Amelia take the spotlight. But as the airline's reforms began to take shape, he couldn't help feeling a sense of pride. One evening, as he sat with his father in their living room, he asked, "Do you think this will last? The changes, Donald Trump looked at his youngest son, his expression uncharacteristically serious. It depends. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't stick unless people fight for it. But you've given them a reason to fight, Barron. That's more than most people ever do. Barron nodded. His father's words resonated deeply. He realized that his small act of kindness had become something far greater than himself. It had sparked a movement that was changing lives and industries, and for the first time, he began to see the value in being part of something bigger. As the airline's reforms continued, public sentiment gradually shifted. Passengers began to return, cautiously optimistic about the company's new direction. Employees, once demoralized, now felt empowered by the changes taking place. And while the scars of the scandal remained, they served as a reminder of the price of complacency. For Barron, the experience was transformative. He had seen firsthand how even the smallest actions could create ripples that grew into waves. And though he hadn't sought the spotlight, he had learned to embrace the responsibility that came with it. As he prepared for another flight months later, Barron smiled at the flight attendant who greeted him warmly. "Thank you for flying with us today, Mr. Trump," she said. "It's my pleasure," Barron replied, his voice steady. This time he knew he was part of something larger. A legacy of kindness, accountability, and change. Months had passed since the initial expose on Sky-High Airlines had rocked the nation. The scandal had reshaped the airline industry and left an indelible mark on corporate America. New regulations had been enacted, whistleblower protections strengthened, and passengers empowered to demand better. The ripple effect of the Sky-High story had reached beyond airlines, inspiring industries across the board to reevaluate their practices. For Barron Trump, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. He had never sought fame, and though he remained a central figure in the public narrative, he preferred to let others take the spotlight. Yet his quiet humility only endeared him further to the public, making him a symbol of how small acts of kindness could lead to monumental change. On a sunny spring morning, Barron boarded another flight, this time for a family trip to Florida. As he entered the plane, he was greeted warmly by the flight attendants who recognized him immediately. "Mr. Trump, it's an honor to have you aboard," one of them said, smiling brightly. "Thank you for what you've done for this industry. You've made us all proud." Barron offered a polite nod, slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I just gave up a seat," he said quietly, his go-to response whenever someone praised him. But as he settled into his seat and glanced out the window, he realized that his actions had become part of something much larger. This was no longer just about him. It was about the countless people whose lives had been touched by the movement his kindness had inspired. At Sky-High Airlines, the transformation was ongoing. Under the leadership of Richard Keller and the guidance of George Lawson, the company had begun to regain public trust. Passenger satisfaction surveys showed marked improvement, and employees reported a newfound sense of pride in their work. The airline had adopted the tagline "Sky-High," where safety and service soar, a nod to its commitment to integrity and excellence. George, now a beloved figure within the company, often visited maintenance hangars and spoke with staff. On one such visit, he was approached by a young mechanic who had just been hired. "Mr. Lawson," the mechanic said, extending a hand, "I just wanted to thank you. I read about everything you've done, and it's the reason I wanted to work here. It's inspiring to see someone fight for what's right." George shook the mechanic's hand, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you," he said. "But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about all of us working together to make this industry better." Amelia Grant, meanwhile, was busier than ever. Her investigative work had expanded beyond airlines, delving into corporate accountability across various sectors. Her series of articles titled "The Cost of Greed: Stories of Reform" had become a national phenomenon, earning her awards and cementing her reputation as one of the country's most fearless journalists. Despite her hectic schedule, Amelia made time to meet with Barron over lunch one afternoon. As they sat in a quiet New York cafe, she smiled across the table at him. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about what happened, about how one decision, one moment, can change so much." Barron sipped his iced tea, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "It's strange. I didn't plan any of this. I just did what felt right. And that's exactly why it worked," Amelia replied. "Sometimes it's the small, genuine acts that create the biggest waves. People see that and realize they can make a difference too." Barron nodded, letting her words sink in. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but now he understood the true power of even the simplest actions. As the months turned into years, the story of Sky High Airlines became a case study in business schools, a lesson in accountability and the power of whistleblowing. Barron's name was often mentioned alongside George Lawson and Amelia Grant. Though he rarely appeared at public events, he preferred to stay in the background, quietly supporting causes that aligned with his values. One day, as he walked through an airport terminal, a little girl approached him, holding her mother's hand. "Are you the boy from the plane?" she asked shyly. Barron knelt to her level, smiling warmly. "I suppose I am," he said. "Why do you ask?" "My mom says you're a hero," the girl replied, her eyes wide with admiration. Barron chuckled softly. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I just tried to be kind." As he stood and watched the girl walk away, Barron realized that in a way her words were true. Not because he had sought to be a hero, but because he had shown the world that kindness, even in its smallest forms, could lead to extraordinary change. That flight to Florida was uneventful, but as Barron gazed out of the window at the clouds below, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He thought about George, Amelia, Rosa, and all the others who had played a part in the story. Together, they had shown that change was possible, that integrity and kindness still mattered in a world that often forgot them. As the plane descended, Barron leaned back in his seat, a small smile on his face. The legacy of change he had helped spark was far from over. It was only just beginning.